And welcome to the show. I'm Mike, your host once again. Thanks for joining. Great presentation we're looking forward to today. We are live on Facebook, streaming the presentation there. So if you're joining us on Facebook, please like and share the video today so we can have as many viewers enjoy this great content as possible. We've got our members joining here on Zoom today. So if you're a member joining on Zoom, again, if you're on Facebook also, you can go share that content. But welcome to Zoom. And this is going to have a live Q&A afterwards, as we usually do. So as we go through the presentation, don't hesitate to start entering your questions into the chat. As usual, if you're on Zoom, you may also be on video. This is a lunchtime presentation, but if you're eating lunch or moving around a lot in the background, maybe just go ahead and turn your video off. And if anybody forgets, then maybe I'll help you out with that. So don't take any offense if that happens. We'll have some announcements at the end of the presentation. We'll have our live Q&A, and we'll just go ahead and get started right now. So to introduce our speaker today, I'm going to hand the meeting over to the president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Saul Lausch.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Professor Dernbach, for being with us. Professor John Dernbach is a nationally and internationally recognized authority on sustainable development, climate change, and environmental law. He is the director of the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center and brings his expertise into the classroom in courses on property, environmental law, international law, and sustainability. Professor Dernbach writes and lectures widely on climate change, sustainable development, and environmental law, as you may have read. He has written more than 50 articles for law reviews and peer-reviewed journals, and has authored, co-authored, or contributed chapters to more than 20 books. Most recently, he and Professor Michael Gerard edited Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. That's the Environmental Law Institute Press of 2019. It's a comprehensive assessment and description of more than 1,000 legal tools that could be used to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. And being optimistic, I hope I'm around for that. There we go. Professor Dernbach, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Saul, for the generous introduction, and thank you all for joining today. I am well aware of how many choices everybody has, even in a time of COVID, and so I'm grateful for your for joining. I'm going to put on share screen right now, and because I've got a fairly short presentation that I'd like to make, and then I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. Can everybody see the screen? Are we good?
Yep.
Okay. So I was asked to talk about climate action, and particularly after the 2020 election, and I intend to do that. And I thought it might be useful to start with a little bit of context here, so that you have an understanding, at least, of where I'm coming from. And part of what I want to try and communicate with these bullet points and is there's a fair bit of urgency here. And I think it's hard really to understate that the level of reduction necessary to get us back to something that approaches a more plausibly optimistic future are significant. And we're living in an interesting time. When I first started working on this issue in the early 1990s, climate change was something that we were that we were kind of worried about, but it was a future thing, and mostly the impacts of climate change weren't very obvious. And now we're in a world where you get how many hurricanes this year, where you get really intense precipitation events that are unlike precipitation events we've gotten before. And the evidence of climate change is really all around us. And at the same time, the economic and job creation case for doing something is really a lot stronger than it's ever been. There's a lot more, actually, the price of renewable energy has gone down, battery technology is improving, you're seeing people using electric cars, and some of the fastest growing jobs in the country, even in the last several years, have been in the wind and solar sectors. It's important to recognize that there are ethical issues here, and the ethical issues involve the distribution of climate impacts on poor and minorities. And the other ethical issue, of course, is the one that a lot of us care about, for our children and grandchildren, and that is the kind of world that they're living in. And the final thing, though, is I want to share, and that's really where my part of the program is going to go, is we can avoid the worst effects of climate change by acting now. And I want to talk about that in the following way. I think I want to start with a key point, and that is that where the action is not just at one level of government, and it's not even just in government. There are a lot of critical places where we can act. The federal government is important. We're all focused on that because of the sort of the transition from Trump to Biden, and I'm going to talk about that. There are also the international arena is also important, and by that I mean not just the sort of countries working together, but also what individual other countries are doing. And we'll find that a lot of individual countries are actually doing quite a lot more than we are. State and local action continues to be really important, even after Biden's election. The private sector continues to have a really important role. And I want to say just one or two things about the personal aspects of this at the conclusion of the presentation. And so really what I'm going to do is work through these areas of where the action is, starting with the federal action. So with respect to federal action, there are really four kinds of actions that are possible. The day one actions that are referred to here are day one actions for the first day of the Biden administration. What kinds of things can Biden do on day one with executive orders and that sort of thing? Then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the rulemakings that are required. As you well know, the Trump administration engaged in a great many regulatory rollbacks of regulations that had been adopted by the Obama administration. Some of the regulations that are required are going to be particularly tricky, and I want to spend a few minutes on those. And a bunch of the things that are needed are going to require congressional action, which, as you know, is going to be challenging because of the fairly close, in terms of Republican and Democrat composition of both the House and the Senate, whatever happens in Georgia. On day one, the most prominent obvious thing Trump can do or excuse me, Biden can do is rejoin the Paris Agreement. I was in Paris in 2015 as an observer when the agreement was adopted, and the symbolic impact of rejoining an international effort in which pretty much every country in the world is engaged or is involved is really, really important. For those of you who don't speak the language, the Paris Agreement basically committed every country in the world to doing as much as it could, figuring out actions on its own that it needed to do in an effort to move towards zero greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of the century. And so it was a voluntary bottom-up effort. It was not at all the way it was depicted by President Trump to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are a whole bunch of other things that can be done. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think you get the idea from looking at the list of how much can be done basically from the administration's end alone. Let me just highlight one thing that on this list that is of some importance, and that is the social cost of carbon. It's kind of a technical point, but it underlies a lot of the regulatory work that needs to be done. The social cost of carbon is a calculation of how much 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide actually costs us. And the Obama administration made a calculation of that. I don't remember the number, but it was a fairly high number. The Trump administration pulled it back to a very, very low number near zero. But what the social scientists and the people who do the calculations on this indicate that the number is actually pretty high. Even 1 ton of carbon dioxide has a significant social cost. And if you build the social cost of carbon into all the different actions that the federal government does or can do, it makes a lot of action on climate change make more economic sense. Um, and you can look at the list, and I'm sure you have while I've talked. But a lot of this is just the major big picture item, in addition to the social cost of carbon, is just stopping the deregulatory train and moving it back in the other direction. And that's something that can be done in on day one without really much from Congress. There are a lot of regulations that need to be changed in order to put us back in the kind of place where we need to be. And I'm going to flag a couple of these again. Part of the reason for the long list is to give you an idea of how long the list actually is. But I want to talk about just a couple of them. The one at the top is particularly important. If there's a single thing that the federal government can do, it's to push the auto industry in the direction of zero emissions and electric cars by increasing steadily and making more stringent on a steady basis the fuel economy standards for motor vehicles. As you may remember, the Obama administration adopted a proposal to move the um, um, fuel economy standards for motor vehicles over 50 miles a gallon by some point in this decade. The Trump people rolled that back. They also um, adopted a rule that basically would prohibit California from having its sort of leadership role on fuel economy standards for motor vehicles. California's leadership role has been incredibly important over the last several decades in getting the auto industry to move toward better fuel economy. And it's not just it's an air pollution and public health issue for sure, but it's also an international competitive issue. It's really hard for US automakers to compete in Europe, China, and other places if their fuel economy standards are more efficient than ours. And so that's one area where rulemaking is going to have a particularly important effect on greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to go to the bottom of the list just to give you a sense of the range of things that are available here and are going to be important. There are historically, the Securities and Exchange Commission has historically required publicly traded corporations to disclose risks that they're subject to. And as climate change intensifies, and the effects of climate change on corporate assets, on corporate behavior, and on corporate profitability begin to get more and more obvious. The Securities and Exchange Commission needs to take a harder look at the disclosure requirements that it requires for climate change. There's a recent report by the Federal Reserve indicating that these issues are more substantial and are going to have a greater effect on the profitability and shareholder returns for publicly traded corporations than we had previously thought. And so requiring these companies to disclose these risks is likely to move their behavior in a better direction. There are some rulemaking issues where they're going to be legally very tricky. One of the things that the Obama administration did was adopt a Clean Power Plan, which was a requirement, a regulatory requirement that would have reduced electric powered emissions by a decent percentage. And they did it in using an interpretation of the Clean Air Act that the Trump administration strongly disagreed with. One of the challenges that is going to exist moving forward is to think about what are the best ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the electric power sector. And without getting into all the issues with the Clean Air Act, I'll just say that that's not an easy thing. Another interesting question is how to use the Dodd-Frank Act to make it harder to invest in fossil fuels. Again, shifting the direction of corporate behavior away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy is something that could have a really profound impact. And then there's a whole bunch of things where action by Congress is required. Obviously, the confirmation of cabinet officials including Biden's nominee to head the Environmental Protection Agency. That's all going to be important. But the mundane, everyday stuff like appropriations and how that kind of money is allocated is important. There are some national laws that, if we're going to really, truly take climate change seriously, we need to adopt. You can see a list here of many of those. I'll just focus on a national clean energy standard. What a national clean energy standard would do is increase the percentage of electricity that is required to be generated by clean energy sources on a sort of a stepwise basis over time, so that the percentage that comes from those clean energy sources would increase over time. And that's something that builds on what a lot of states have done with renewable portfolio standards, or in the case of Pennsylvania, an alternative energy portfolio standard, which has increased the percentage of renewable energy generated in Pennsylvania. Um, Obviously, one of the issues that's going to exist at the congressional level is the extent to which bipartisan coalitions can develop and get some of this done. And I think that's going to be an interesting question. At the international level, rejoining the Paris Agreement, which I indicated earlier, would be a good thing to do. Um, has some interesting consequences and raises some interesting issues. Um, Under the Paris Agreement, countries are required to make what is called a nationally determined contribution, and to identify that nationally determined contribution. And basically what that is how much is each country going to contribute to the internationally collective effort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. Um, and the first step of that was a commitment for emissions reductions by 2025. And what the Obama people did is they said, well, we think we can cut greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. And of course, one of the things that happened when the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement is they pulled the rug out from under that nationally determined contribution. As it turns out, the US as of 2019 had reduced its emissions from 2005 levels by a little over 12%, which is pretty good, but not great. Um, and this year, with the next conference of the parties for the climate change treaty coming up in Glasgow in November, if the U.S. Um, rejoins, and it's certain U.S. is going to do, when the U.S. rejoins, one of the things it's going to have to do is set a new nationally determined contribution for 2030. The whole idea of the Paris Agreement, again, is to ratchet up ambition on 5-year periods. And so for the period from 2025 to 2030, the question is what is the Biden administration going to commit the U.S. to? This is non-binding, but still it's important as a way of setting a goal. And to give you a sense of what's happening here, the European Union has already set a goal of getting to zero by 2050, something that we have not done. China's saying we'll get to net zero by 2060, and Japan is saying we'll get there by 2050. Now, what net zero means is not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also what is a particular country going to do to offset any greenhouse gas emissions that it emits. And so if you plant more trees, if you sequester carbon in the soil through agriculture, if you have technology that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, all of those things remove carbon dioxide and can count toward uh, um, getting emissions to a net of zero. At the state level, what you see is a great deal more. By the way, the one thing I want to come back to on this is that what China, Japan, and the EU are doing is they're all putting pressure on the US. My whole life has been about As a background sort of data point for much of my life has been about U.S. leadership globally. Um, like many of you, I grew up, after World War II, with in the effect of the Marshall Plan and the U.S. leadership on a great many of the treaties and international agreements, including the United Nations, that form sort of the global frame or understanding that we have about how the world works. And part of the challenge that we're going to have rejoining Paris is joining it with a considerable amount of humility. We are very much flipping and flopping and getting hot and cold internationally on climate change as you go from one administration to another. And what I think the world is looking for to some degree from the United States is what level of policy stability on climate change can it get? And that certainly has not been the case. And I don't mean just from Obama to Trump, but even before that. So that's an issue that is going to be of some concern. Um, at the state level and also at the local level, looking ahead to the slide after this one, there's considerably more policy stability. Um, and I did a paper with the students in a seminar in the year 2000, where we looked at about 17 different legal tools that states had been using that had some impact on climate change. There were renewable portfolio standards, there were forestry rules, there were all sorts of other things that we looked at. And what we found, and I published this, as I said, in 2020, and what we found was the students and I is that the reason states were acting was not just to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to build their economies, to create jobs, to foster the development of new technology, to reduce the impact of fuel price fluctuations on the poor and on businesses, and also to reduce energy costs. All of those things, all of those things come with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's a tendency, I think, a lot of us have to think about climate change as a standalone issue that's unrelated to other things. But what states have seen for more than 20 years is that you can do a lot of these things without, you can do a lot of these things that are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and have other benefits as well. One of the things that is happening in Pennsylvania that a lot of you, I'm quite sure, are aware of is there's a proposal by the Environmental Quality Board, the rulemaking body for the Department of Environmental Protection, to establish a cap and trade program for power plants for carbon dioxide. That would enable us to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which right now is a coalition of about 10 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic that are working to address climate change. And one of the interesting things about the cap and trade program is that the allowances, the permission to to emit greenhouse gases, are sold on a ton by ton basis on an auction, and the auction proceeds go back to the state, are distributed among the states. That auction money in other states has been used to fund renewable energy and energy efficiency, and do a lot of other things that have substantial documented economic and benefits for the people in these other states. And the one other issue that we need to deal with, because again, in Pennsylvania, we like to think that we're leaders, is that other states are adopting some pretty ambitious requirements. You can see what I'm showing here for Hawaii, New York, and Washington. They're not alone. But these three are states that have actually adopted these goals in law, not in governor's executive orders that can be repealed, but actually in law. And I'd say if you're looking at a pattern on state action, it's intensifying. The number and type of legal tools that are being adopted is growing year by year. And not in every state certainly, but in many states. At the local level, again, I think there's a lot more policy stability, but what you're seeing is a lot of local governments becoming more and more interested in doing work on climate change. In local governments, you can say, well, the federal government is really where it's at, and a lot of us think that in a certain way because of all the conversation about what's going on with Trump and then Biden on climate change. But actually, the local governments have all sorts of responsibilities that are quite different from and are in addition to um, the responsibilities that the federal government has, or even to some degree that the states have. And I've listed some of these, not just land use and transportation, but also economic development. And with more and more really intense precipitation events, stormwater is a significant issue. I should add that COVID in the post-COVID world is going to offer some really interesting opportunities for local governments. I've been working with a bunch of local government and local government organizations from here in Widener. And what the world that they're seeing post-COVID is a somewhat different world. It's a world in which office space, there's going to be sort of probably less demand for office space, and those buildings are going to need to be repurposed. There's probably going to be more working at home and some more demand for home-based businesses. And there's some other opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that I think are likely to be greater in a post-COVID world. The Department of Environmental Protection has set up a local climate action program. Um, and I've highlighted the link there, so if you folks want the slides afterwards, I'll send them to you, and you can find that link. But they offer grants to every year to 20 municipalities that are seeking to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I know Carlisle in our area is one of them. And the other thing that I've done is have students working with these local governments draft model ordinances to address a wide variety of climate change issues. And I've posted those online, and you can find them easily. One area that doesn't get as much attention as it might is the private sector, and particularly here I mean corporations. A couple of colleagues of mine, Mike Vandenberg and Professor Gilligan, have done some calculations, and as you can see, the potential if corporations on their own reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and they work together to do that, as many of them are already doing, the potential for emissions reductions um, is pretty substantial. And the thing to keep in mind here is that companies are not just doing this. I mean, the greenwashing, making false or misleading claims about what companies do is a common worry among a lot of my friends. But um, companies are acting to address and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Google, Apple, others, big corporations, but also smaller corporations for a boatload of reasons. You can see the list here. Um, and a lot of it is just to save money. The less energy you use, the better. And the reputational benefits, there's a lot more customer pressure, particularly for companies that produce consumer goods. Um, and there's lots of reputational benefits. In the world in which I work, law firms are getting interested more and more in doing this kind of work, partly because the younger generation, the people that they want to hire, the smart young people that sort of are going to run the world at some point, this is what they want. And this is what they want to see from their employers, and this is what they want to see from the businesses that they work with. And so you're seeing a lot more of that as well. And so if you look at the broader landscape of not just the federal government and its impact on international, but if you look at other countries, if you look at states, if you look at the local government, and you look at the private sector, there's going to be quite a lot of continuity. And there has been, even through the Trump years, quite a lot of continuity with what they had been doing before. And I think continuity probably doesn't even describe it quite accurately enough. I think you're seeing intensifying effort in all of those sectors. And then just finally on personal point in terms of this, there's a lot of things you can do sort of on your own, and I think you all get that, and I'm not going to go through that except to highlight one thing. I was talking to a Sierra Club activist a couple of years ago, and he made an interesting point. He said, look, the single thing that people on their own can do in Pennsylvania is to change their electricity provider. That one thing. Now, this comes out of electric deregulation, and I think it goes back to, oh my God, way more than a decade ago, um, when Pennsylvania sort of signed off on this. And the idea was that you ought not to be stuck with your local utility in terms of the price that you pay for electricity, that you ought to be able to choose who your electric provider is. And what's really interesting, if you go to the PA Power Switch site, and oh, by the way, if you go out on Google and you look for PA Power Switch, there's like 5 things that you see that say PA Power Switch before you actually get to the one that comes from PA Power Switch. But if you go out to Google and look for that, and you look for what the choices are that you have for electricity, something really interesting has happened in the last couple of years. And the really interesting thing that has happened in the last couple of years is that renewable electricity prices are cheaper in many cases than conventional energy. And you can go out and you can do some comparisons, and you can work on that, and you can see that. And so at my church, for example, we switched over to 100% renewable electricity. And we did that in my house, and you can do that too. If the Sierra Club activist is right, it would be a really big deal if more and more people did that. It was mentioned at the beginning that I worked on a book, Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. There's a summary and key recommendations version of that, which you can find free online. The book itself is a big book. We found more than 1,000 legal tools. There's really nothing quite like this book. If you want a comprehensive description of an analysis of all the different legal tools that are out there to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the interesting things about this, and I highlighted this in a book, in an article, The Dozen Types of Legal Tools in the Deep Decarbonization Toolbox, a lot of these legal tools aren't even regulatory. A lot of these involve getting law out of the way. A lot of them involve changes in insurance law. They involve changes in the way in private law, and in all manner of other things that are really, frankly, not regulatory. In fact, most of the legal tools that are described in the book are not regulatory. And to me, that's an important insight, because the climate change issue comes with sort of a whole set of political triggers that people hold inside, depending on which side of the aisle they're on. And part of what Professor Michael Girard at Columbia Law School and I were trying to do when we put this book together was to identify everything. What are all the different choices? What possibilities exist? Now, when we got done with the book, we took one more step. We decided to find lawyers and law firms to turn the recommendations in the book into model laws. And not just for the federal government, but for state and local governments. And the last thing you see on this particular slide is the website. And if you remember nothing else, it's lpdd.org. And you can go to that website and you can find a boatload of resources, model laws and other resources, many of which, if you want to be active at the state level, if you want to be active at the local level, provide you with opportunities of moving the ball forward without having to do a lot of your own drafting and analysis. This is stuff that you can basically pull off the shelf and adapt a little bit and find people, I think, who might be interested in introducing it and adopting it. So this is how to find me, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent presentation. There's been a lot of interest. I would go so far as to say, and I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb here to say this is our best attended event yet. We've had close to 85 people joining us on Zoom and on Facebook. I'm sure Chris can let me know if I'm mistaken about that in the chat, but I think that's pretty close. I do want to mention for everybody who's joining us, a lot of us are members here today, and we truly appreciate your membership. It allows us to keep bringing you this great content during even this pandemic. We've been able to keep this going. A lot of our programs are also supported by donations as well. The scholarship programs, part of the Great Decisions program we do, the Academic World Quest. So if anybody is interested in making a donation to the organization, you can head over to wacredding.org/donate, and that'll help us keep funding some of those programs that we normally do during our regular programming years. And also Saul's going to talk to us at the end about how you could join the organization if you've been enjoying as a guest consuming this great content. We'd love to have you as a member. Okay, so tons of questions in the chat here, John. Again, a ton of interest in this topic, so I'm going to try and get us through as many of these as we can today. So let's start with so there's the politics of this and there's the science of this, right? And I remember early in the pandemic reading something that said it will feel like we are overreacting in cases like this until we very suddenly realize that we're underreacting, right? What do you think the transition from, like right now it's easy to think like, oh, these consequences are still 5, 6, 7, 10 years away. What's it going to look like early on as we start to realize the general public and our political leaders that this is an emergency?
Well, I think what you're seeing, frankly, is it's beginning to happen already, and it's happening in a variety of different ways. And I'll give you some examples of the kinds of things that are happening. Out in Western Pennsylvania, because for starters, in terms of the science, the warmer the atmosphere is, the more moisture it holds, and that's true whether it's rain or snow. And so one of the effects of climate change is an increased number of really severe precipitation events. And what I mean by that is multiple inches of rain in 1 or 2 or 3 hours. And so instead of the kind of rain that we'd been used to for hundreds and hundreds of years, where a thunderstorm might knock down an inch and a half of rain occasionally, but most of the rain that we got was in relatively small amounts or came down fairly slowly. What we're getting now is 5, 6, 7 inches of rain in 2 or 3 hours with a fair bit of frequency. And there really isn't any dispute about that. I mean, the documentation on that is pretty solid. One of the things that means for local governments is that stormwater and flooding are becoming bigger and bigger issues. In terms of the local governments that I work with, that's absolutely the case. And stormwater is an issue for other reasons as well, water quality and so forth. But the intensity of these events has gotten a lot of attention. It's also gotten a lot of attention in Western Pennsylvania. And what you're seeing in Western Pennsylvania is where there's a lot more steeper slopes and so forth, there's a lot more landslides that block highways. And that costs a lot of money. And I have friends in the Pennsylvania Geological Survey who have documented how much more that's costing state and local governments just in the last 5-10 years. Another example, and again, there's lots of these sorts of examples, is crop pests that are showing up in agriculture in Pennsylvania that didn't used to exist in Pennsylvania. And you're seeing warmer winters. You're seeing less investment in the ski industry. You're seeing, sort of really intense, longer and more hot days in the summer, and less snow and so forth in the winter. And so it all, but what happens on this, what makes climate change different, and I think, Mike, this is what you were alluding to, is that there's a certain kind of event that gets our attention. 9/11 got our attention. Pearl Harbor got our attention. We're programmed for sudden dramatic stuff getting our attention. What we're not programmed for is the steady, slow accumulation of bad events, in making sense out of those. And that, I think, is the challenge of this.
Yeah, and I think that, again, we've got a ton of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to keep us moving through these. But I think that's the struggle, right? You still hear this argument. Here in Reading today, we're enjoying our first snowfall of the year. So people would say, well, there's evidence that it's not global warming, which we can't accept as a good faith argument at this point anymore, but we still hear that from time to time. And I just, I don't know, like everybody on this call, probably I'm a little anxious to start hearing our leaders catch up on some of that. Okay, so let's try and get through some of the questions here. I'll group them as much as I can by category, but we do have a bunch here. So from John Fleming, a member here in our Zoom chat, can you comment on the appointment of John Kerry? And I think I would expand that to say, I think there's some early indications that climate change, global warming, is going to be an issue across a variety of appointments. We see it, I think, in Treasury. We see it, I think, in national security. So what are the early indications that you see? How do you feel about what you're seeing with the proposed cabinet positions?
Well, I like Kerry's appointment a lot, and I like the approach that Biden is taking. I mean, this is a big deal issue. It's a big deal for the Defense Department in terms of the stability of its military bases and in terms of the kinds of the kinds of problems that the Defense Department is going to be called upon to deal with in coming years. But Kerry's a high-profile guy. I saw him speak at the climate conference in Madrid last year. He's been active on this issue for a long time. He's respected internationally, and he brings a kind of a gravitas or heft to the issue of climate change that even in the Obama administration we didn't see. And so I like that, and I like the across-the-board approach the Biden administration is taking. What I'm sensitive to is that there are limits to what the administration can do by itself. And I'm hopeful that they can find ways of working on both sides of the aisle on at least some legislation in addition to the sort of across the cabinet approach to climate change that they're taking.
I think that's one of the things that people are hoping Biden brings to the table is that long history of bipartisanship. So hopefully we do see some of that. Bill Litvin in chat here on Zoom asks, hoping that you'll talk about how much progress toward net zero EU, China, and Japan have achieved currently, and also that if the EU goal is net zero, why is Russia building Nord Stream 2 to provide additional natural gas from Russia to Germany?
Let me just start with this. The transition is hard because I think I understand what's underneath the message, which is some skepticism about long-term goals. And I think some skepticism about countries that do set long-term goals is completely appropriate. What happens is that there's a certain number of things that you can do that are actually pretty easy, or at least not easy. They're fairly straightforward. You can ramp up the amount of renewable electricity that you use. That's a fairly straightforward thing to do. There's some other things that are harder to do. And the higher you go in terms of clean energy, the more challenges that exist. The reality, though, is that the EU is ahead of us. They adopted a cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions that they learned about from the United States. And they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by, I don't know, 20% or more from 1990 levels over the last decade or two, something that, and they were tooling along just fine economically. And no one ever said, well, the Europeans are being held back by the early reductions they got in greenhouse gas emissions. It's true that later reductions and that reductions in countries like China are going to be challenging. And I think there's a whole bunch of things that you can do to accelerate the transition. Part of this is international cooperation. Some of this is what's already going on with the dramatically reduced prices of wind and solar technologies, which I think are going to make even coal and coal look like an imprudent investment, even in developing countries in the decades ahead. I could say a whole lot more about this, but I think I'll stop and let you go on to your next question.
Yeah, huge topic and lots of interest. So, have a block of questions about. You had mentioned the economic case for taking action here, and so I'm gonna kind of throw a couple questions out. You can jump on whatever resonates most, and just kind of sum up the theme here. So, Larry Cohen says, regarding Wall Street, how effective are public de-invest efforts in industries and corporations in influencing corporate behaviors, especially in the hydrocarbon and extraction sectors, renewable energy and ETFs, mutual funds are available for redirecting investor options. John Fleming says, comment on Elon Musk's flight from regulations and how will a company follow these regulations. Brad Dengler says, with more and more companies publishing sustainability reports along with their annual financial statements, and your comments about the SEC doing more, is there an argument that it may not be necessary if the companies have already begun? So I think the way, is there more than the short-term financial incentive that's going to drive change for these companies? And then if there are any of those specific items you wanted to touch on, please do.
Well, let me talk about companies that have a long-term horizon. Let's just start with that, okay? And let's talk particularly about utilities. In any other company that is making investments that have to return, where they're looking for a return over multiple decades. Every single company in that position needs to be looking ahead in the next couple of decades and saying, how is this going to work? And this is not the next quarter for shareholders. This is like looking long term, and utilities basically are doing that. When Trump was elected, a lot of the utilities said, well, that's nice. He's going to be president for maybe 4 years, possibly 8. But you know what? We've got a longer time horizon than that. And so for those companies that have longer time horizons, I think a lot of this is going to resonate pretty deeply. And if you go from company to company to company in terms of how they think about the world, you get different answers. And I don't think there's it's hard to generalize, except to say that I think a growing fraction of these companies are taking the issue more seriously, and they're doing more serious things. The sustainability reporting that was alluded to by one of your questioners, there are hundreds and hundreds of companies that are doing sustainability reports now. How serious are they? Well, some of them are. And certainly they're doing more than they were a few decades ago. And I think that's kind of how this works. There's always people who are sort of stand out as hypocritical, or they're dragging their heels, or they're not doing as much as they could. And change doesn't come smoothly. It's bumpy. But if you look over the last couple decades, I think that's the direction where you see things moving.
All right. So sorry, we had a question in the chat about showing more people. If you're watching in gallery view, you're going to see the entire audience. But if you can switch over to presenter view, then you should see the featured speaker here. I'll see if there's anything I can do about that in between questions here. Okay. Mark Smith from Facebook asks, you talked about green job creation, but like net zero carbon emissions, the real question is about net job creation. How are the job losses and shifts accounted for in thinking about the move to green jobs?
Well, one of the really, really hard and important issues with this is how do you make the transition work? How do you deal with people in communities and in industries that are going to be adversely affected by this? What do you do with them? And the hard cold reality, I think, is that this has been going on for a long time. And a lot of the people, for example, that have black lung have not been from coal mining, retire early or die from black lung, and they have. And I think there's an argument to be made that they've never really been fully taken care of, and certainly these communities haven't been. And I think there's an argument to be made that if you go to the communities where fossil fuel extraction has been the most intense, I think you see some of the hardest economic problems regionally. You see them in parts of Pennsylvania where coal mining was a really big deal at one point. You see them in other states as well. And I think that one of the things that we need to emphasize harder and to pay more attention to is what you do with those communities and regions. And one of the things that I think, and I'll give you an example of the kind of thing that where I think more discussion needs to occur, but it's also a positive development, is a bunch of mayors, Mayor Peduto in Pittsburgh and a lot of other sort of Midwestern and Rust Belt mayors recently proposed a kind of Marshall Plan for their region. That was a lot about economic development in that region and pushing it in a clean energy direction. And I think it's important to pay attention to developments like that and not assume that the people who are advocating green energy are oblivious to this, because there's a lot of us who are working on this that are pretty sensitive to that and are looking for ways to move the ball forward there.
Yeah, excellent. And I think I noticed part of the issue with seeing the video might actually be that you're still sharing your screen. So maybe while we do the next question here.
Stop that?
Yeah, if you turn that off, I think it might make it easier for people to see you. Absolutely,
okay,
absolutely. No problem. I think we found a short-term solution anyway. Randy Newnham, long-term member, sits on the board of the World Affairs Council, local professor here at Penn State Berks. Do we need to ban fracking to make serious climate progress?
Okay, so a couple of things about fracking to start with. There are hundreds and hundreds of permits. Well, first of all, big picture. If you think about the fracking issue from the standpoint of the national election, the distinction that the Biden people did not effectively make is between what goes on public land and what goes on private land. He meant that, he said that, but he didn't say it clearly enough. And so if you say, do we want, on public land, do we out west, for example, do we want more fracking? Should the federal government ban fracking? Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea for the federal government to just not issue any more leases for fracking or coal mining on public land. I think that's a good move. It sends a leadership signal, and it doesn't stop anybody from doing what they're already permitted to do. In Pennsylvania, by contrast, you have hundreds and hundreds of permits that have been issued for fracking on private land. And I mean, I worked at the Department of Environmental Protection for 15 years. I counseled the coal mining program in the early 1980s. Once people have permits, you don't just go in and take them away from them without a really good reason. And so it's hard for me to see how you would ban fracking in a place like Pennsylvania without some really, really, really compelling factual argument. And I think you could say, well, but look at all the science, look at where it's going. And I get that. But I'm thinking that this is probably, if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, this is probably not your first move. I think that, I think there are many, many other things to do in the meantime. And you may not need, and the other problem you have is that if in order to make a transition work, you have to have energy while you have to have some form of energy while you put the new renewable clean energy and energy efficiency requirements and provisions into place. And so there's probably going to be some need for gas for some finite period of time. And the hard thing is, and I remember speaking at an event at the Marcellus Shale Coalition several years ago, and they were acting like, well, we're going to be producing gas in Pennsylvania for the foreseeable future, way out to 2050 and beyond. And that's certainly not consistent with my vision of a transition to clean energy. And so I think one of the challenges that you have, certainly with the gas industry, is how do you sort of move toward cleaner energy in a way that also, I think, moves away from gas as well. And what I'm hopeful is that the continued reduction in costs for solar and wind are going to make that an easier transition from a public acceptability point of view than it might otherwise be.
Yeah, so part of what I heard there is it's a lot easier to ban fracking if you've already got a full green infrastructure in place to fill all those needs. But by that point, there's not as much profit in the fracking anyway, so maybe that part of the industry just disappears. So, question from John Fleming. You had mentioned as part of your presentation that individuals, the most important thing we can do is to change power providers. He asks, are there green options on choosing gas as there are with choosing electricity?
There's a provider I'm aware of that is selling offsets for gas. All right, and I don't know anything about it really, and I haven't inquired in it with any depth, but I think that's about the only place where you would go. If what you wanted to do is be totally emissions free on gas, you'd probably have to figure out purchase of gas offsets. And what you'd have to figure out is something that I can't answer, which is how real are the offsets? One of the issues that you have with offsets, in other words, you say, well, I'm going to be emitting so much carbon dioxide here, but we'll do something else over there that reduces carbon dioxide, is would those reductions be going on anyway, or are those reductions going on only to offset what your particular emissions? Otherwise, the offsets aren't really offsets. It's just a way of feeling good about what you're already doing.
Yeah.
And so I think you'd have to look at that, and I'm not. Oh, it looks like I'm seeing on the chat here between renewable natural gas and non-renewable natural gas. I don't know anything about the availability of renewable natural gas in Pennsylvania. Okay, that's something you could look at.
Okay, and we can kind of crowdsource that question too. If anybody has information about a local company that offers those offsets, then you could put that into the chat, and I'll drop it into the video here as we're going through. So that message about the renewable natural gas came from Scott Case, who has submitted a couple questions here. Very active in the local community on this front. Says, as the chair of the City of Reading's Environmental Council, and he also mentions that they're helping to develop leadership in the Community Action Plan. So if anybody wants to participate in that, you can connect with him through the chat. He says, I'm curious to know what climate actions you think that Berks County and the City of Reading should prioritize. What local PA communities should we be emulating? And then I'll also mention, Larry adds again, local municipalities can have tremendous impact on reducing carbon GHG emissions. Zoning ordinances are effective. Think Global Act Local. So what should the city and county be doing?
Well, okay, I don't live in Reading, and I don't live in Berks County, so I'm not going to tell you what to do in terms of substance, but I can make some process questions. Okay, the process is figure out who the really good local governments are in terms of climate change and sustainability, and just see what they're doing. Lancaster is a good example. I send my students, we interact with Lancaster every single year. They're doing all sorts of really interesting stuff. Um, Harrisburg is doing a few interesting things. I don't know, in your part of the world, Philadelphia is doing all kinds of good stuff, but I'm not sure how much of that is replicable. The other thing you might take a look at, there's a couple of places where you might go in terms of ordinances beyond sort of the legal pathways site and the ordinances that my students have posted. And there's a sustainable development law index, or I'm not thinking of the name of it, but there's a website where they have all sorts of model laws for sustainable development at the local level. And that you can get ordinances, you can get the experience of those local governments and that sort of thing. Beyond sort of just the research question, here are some promising areas. I would look hard at mixed use zoning. I would look really hard at adaptive reuse of commercial properties. I would look really hard at anything you can do that would make downtown Reading more attractive. There's a whole bunch of folks who are working in the area of what is called walkable communities. And where you do where there's a lot of what is called destination walking. And what I mean by that is, in my neighborhood, which is pretty much a single-use kind of neighborhood, people walk for exercise. But what happens if you can walk 3 blocks to the drugstore to buy a toothbrush? I bet frankly that the number of people on the Zoom call who can walk 3 blocks to get a toothbrush is probably less than 20% of the people on the call. I'm going to guess that for a lot of you, you need to drive probably more than a mile to even buy a toothbrush. And if we could walk to get a toothbrush and then to get our hair cut and then to pick up a couple of free groceries and then come back to where we live, you get a different kind of community. And it's not just the climate impact of that in terms of not driving, but it's also uh, 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 um, the whole issue of interacting with other people, and all the community benefits that you get from that. Um, and so I would think about, in terms of Reading and Berks County, what I would think about is what kinds of things that other local governments are doing that would make us more attractive to young people, would make us more attractive for people to stay here, would encourage us, so our kids didn't feel like they had to move away. Okay, what kind, and maybe the kids in Reading and Berks County don't feel that way, but I know in my part of the world a lot of people do. And what would just make the place more attractive? And look around and see what other people are doing. And I think, as I said, Lancaster's an interesting example. It's comparable size, but there's a lot of other communities as well. And recognize, I mean, the other thing I'd say, going back to this whole issue of change, is it's lumpy bumpy. You make progress for a while, then maybe you don't, then you have to pick it up again. And this is not something that is going to be fixed in a short period of time. It requires steady, dedicated effort.
Sure. Now we've got we like that lumpy bumpy phrase. So I've got about a half dozen questions left. Are you still okay for time?
Yeah.
Okay. Probably won't take too many more questions from the chat, but I'll try to get through the ones that we've got now, and then we'll look to start winding up. Larry Cohen again asks, the Republican-controlled General Assembly is fighting Governor Wolf aggressively to prevent Pennsylvania's entry into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. We can encourage. I guess so. He's proposing this as a solution. We can encourage our legislators to support the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and then related to the government involvement, Craig Keemer says, how would the proposed Advanced Research Project Agency for Climate (ARPA-C) differ from the existing Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy (ARPA-E), and how big a role do you see for energy from green hydrogen?
Well, okay. So on green hydrogen, I think that's a real option, and it needs to be looked at. I think there's some promise there. I think the people, some of the people that I've talked to about climate change, pose the issue about technology, because I think that's what the ARPA question is really directed at. What they basically say is that, to a significant degree, if we are able to successfully avoid the worst impacts of climate change, a lot of it is going to be based on technologies that are not yet invented and technologies that have not even been conceptualized. Think about that. Now, where do we get the ability to create or develop those kinds of technologies? Well, companies are all working from the standpoint of what's it, company research and development tends to be oriented toward their own agenda. But the larger social questions about technology development, if they're not answered by the government, they don't get answered and they don't get addressed. And so what the larger ARPA, I think, is about is stuff that is not just, I mean, it's sort of a broader look at what you can do. How much, for example, can you do with certain kinds of, how much carbon sequestration can you actually get out of agriculture? There's a lot of interesting things that we haven't really figured out there. And so my understanding of the broader ARPA is that it would reach a broader range of technologies and a broader range of technological options, and probably a higher level of intensity.
Yeah, and looking at those alternatives, I guess Anita Jester asks, how can you eliminate hydrocarbons from plastics and other industries where they are basic?
I don't know the technological answer to that. I mean, some of this is, if we had a system with plastic that was less one use, you had more of a circular economy organized around plastic. You could keep a lot of plastic in circulation just because it would be recycled over and over again. Beyond that, I mean, I think the other issue is what do you make plastic from? And do you need to use petroleum-based hydrocarbons for that? And I know that there's been a fair bit of research and some development in terms of making plastic out of things that are not that are not fossil fuels, plant matter, for example. But I'm not going to say that I really understand the technology on that very well.
Fair enough. Saul asks, President of the Council here, did your introduction today. There's little public discussion on ocean power as an alternative source to generate electricity. Any thoughts you can share on that?
Back when I was in college in the early 1970s, we were talking about ocean power for energy, and we're still talking about ocean power for energy. And it went back in the 70s, it looked like one of those once in future things. And right now, I mean, I can't say that I know much about it, but I can't say that I've heard much about it. So I'm thinking that may be some ways away. The closest I get to ocean power is offshore wind, which is a bigger and bigger thing across the Atlantic coast. And it's certainly a big deal off the coast of Denmark, in a lot of the Baltic states.
All right, we're starting to wind down here. Just a couple of questions left. Scott Case asks, what is your number one go-to response when you encounter skeptics who think efforts to prevent or mitigate climate change are unnecessary?
My number one go-to response, well, I mean, you know, I've been bottled up in my house now since March. So I'm not encountering a lot of climate skeptics. You know, on climate, on that whole issue, I mean, I have sort of I'm not convinced that you can convince climate skeptics to change their minds. I don't see how you can do that. And the people who come to that position, a lot of them, you know, are not going to be moved by anything you say. And so what I try to do, for example, I'll go back to my church where their climate skeptics abound, is I work on relationships with those people on other issues. In the broader world, though, when I talk about this is, again, I try to figure out where people are coming from. If somebody just says this is not a big deal, it's like, well, why don't you think it's a big deal? What do you base that on? Where are you coming from? What is your source of information? And what do you really value? And what if you're wrong? I mean, I think just asking people questions about why they think what they think is a useful starting point on that if people are going to confront you with it. And to try to unpack where they're coming from. Because where a lot of people are coming from is, well, Rush said it. Or, you know, I just don't think humans can have that much impact on the climate because we're just, you know, the grass withers and dies, and what are humans really that they can affect something as big as the climate? And you have to, I think, figure out where people are coming from before you can really respond to them effectively.
Yeah, and I wonder how big some of these groups are of the people that really are just hardcore global warming deniers. I think there has been some success at increased mobilization of a smaller group of people. They certainly make a lot of noise. I think it's easy to overestimate the impact that they have, except to the extent that they're more likely to go out and take action. So I think if we just acknowledge that we're the larger group of people, but we only can take advantage of that by taking action with those bigger numbers, I think that goes a long way towards addressing the issue.
The other thing that, if I can, just one last thing
Absolutely.
on climate skepticism, where a lot of people are coming from, climate skepticism is not really about science. Okay, climate skepticism is about government. And it's just a proxy for government. the people that are skeptical about government to effectively solve this problem tend to, in my view, in my experience anyway, tend to analyze the problem in the following way. If government touches this, it's going to be a mess. Therefore, I'm not going to believe in the science that would support it. Okay? That, I think, is where, and I'm not everybody, but over and over and over again, and I have had face-to-face conversations with people about this, is where they're coming from is they're skeptical about government. And then if they're skeptical about government, then there's a bunch of openings that become available. Well, what if, do you recognize that the government subsidizes fossil fuels? Do you think that's a good thing? Well, no, because I'm a libertarian and I don't think the government should do that. Okay, well, so if we got rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, you'd be okay with that? Yeah. And then you can begin to build a conversation about that if you find out, again, it's where people are really coming from.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. Okay, so as we start to wind down here, just the two kind of fun questions. Either what's the most interesting aspect of the work that you do, or if that's hard to answer, you could answer like, where did your interest in this come from?
Well, okay, so let's go back. Where did my interest in this come from? Way back, I grew up in northern Wisconsin, hunting and fishing with my dad, and I spent a lot of time outdoors. We debated pollution control my senior year in high school. I think I've felt for a long time that this is just a comfortable place for me to be working, doing environmental work. And partly it's just sort of knowing what's going on in the outdoors and respecting that. The climate issue is somewhat more recent. But I think if what really pulls at me, even in the most frustrating, difficult times, we produced this. I remember the morning after Trump was elected, and we were still beginning to work on the Legal Pathways book. I sent out an email to the, 50 odd contributing authors to our book. And I said, you know what? This project is more important now than it ever was. And I think, frankly, that's sort of what motivates me. I think is the feeling that I'm doing work that might actually matter. And I think on this issue, the other thing that is helpful is knowing that there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of other people that are working on this as well. To work on this issue, you're not alone. There are a lot of other folks that are working on it. It's a good community to be in, and it's a good thing to be working on.
Yeah, it's hard to grow up outside like that and not be concerned about the environment, I'm sure. So we'll wrap up on this. What is the best news you've heard with respect to global warming recently?
The best news, Lordy. Well, the best news is Biden's election. Okay. I think there's other news as well, but the big picture issue is that we're going to be moving forward on this issue again. As every day passes and the election lawsuits and all of the rest of that diminish, I think that's the best recent news. If the election had gone the other way, this would be a very different presentation today.
Agreed. All right. I have truly appreciate our conversation today. Very well attended and loved by our members based on the feedback I'm already seeing from the chat. Any final thoughts? Anything you want to plug? Anything to promote while you're here today?
Go to the LPD website. Look at the model laws. See what's out there. And if you're involved with the local government, if you're thinking about being involved with the local government, see what the tools are out there. Send that. Somebody said in the chat, contact your local legislator on joining Reggie. Get them on the right side. mean, I think the big thing here is we live in an extraordinary time. It's not, it's, the climate is actually changing. I can see from the faces here that there are a lot of people that are my age, and on this, in our lifetimes, and even in the last 10 or 20 years, the climate is already changing. And I think the question is what do we do differently because of that? What little things do we do? What adjustments do we make? And I think if a lot of us make a lot of adjustments, um, the world is going to be a better place.
Love it, love it, love it. Thank you for joining. Thanks to all our members on Zoom and everybody who's joining us there. If you enjoyed this presentation, make sure you're following us on Facebook. Make sure you're following us on YouTube. The recordings will be there, facebook.com/whackreading. Same on YouTube/whackreading. Share the videos, like the videos, subscribe to the channels. It's the best way you can help support this programming in particular. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Saul for some announcements, and he'll also talk to you about some membership for the World Affairs Council. You there, Saul?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, Professor Dernbach. Very, very well done today. We're so interested in your perspective on things. You've covered a whole wide range of thinking, and quite evident, as Mike has said, in the number of comments and questions we've received. So thanks very, very much. And a reminder to you, sir, we have something for you. You said you like the Pennsylvania Dutch culture when we spoke earlier for a bit.
Yep.
If you're down this way, I'll take you over to Shady Maple over in New Holland, over in Lancaster County, for the Pennsylvania Dutch meal at the Mennonite people who run that place out.
Sign me up. He said it in public. He made a public promise, everybody. Remember that. I'm going to take him up on this.
Well, probably wait till the spring, but let's see what happens. So,
wait till we get a vaccine.
Yeah. Well, we're changing direction completely and doing something a week from today, December 16 at noon. We have James Olson speaking on My Friend the Spy, the notorious case of FBI Special Agent Robert Hanssen. To my knowledge, at least in my years with the World Affairs Council, we've never had a topic quite like this. And we think you'll find it interesting. During his FBI career, Mr. Olson was a close FBI colleague and friend of Mr. Hanssen, who was arrested in 2001 and charged and convicted of committing espionage on behalf of the former Soviet Union and its successor states. This spy, Mr. Hanssen, is now serving a life sentence without parole. In January, our two programs scheduled in January 13. We have Wednesday, January 13 at noon, Nick Eftimides speaking on international security. He is a retired U.S. from the U.S. Department of Defense, and his 34-year government career included work at the CIA, another spy, the U.S. Department of State, Diplomatic Security Service, and Defense Intelligence Agency. His book, Chinese Intelligence Operations, received worldwide recognition when it was published, as the Chinese government declared him to be an enemy of the people. You may recall him from 2 years ago. He was a guest previously with us in September of 2018 when he spoke on strategic issues for the 21st century. And then our second program in January, make note of this, Thursday, January 28 at 4 p.m. Dr. Lee Lukoff is speaking on Israeli politics, the state of U.S.-Israeli relations, and the recent peace accords. Dr. Lukoff teaches at the University of Georgia's Washington Semester Program, and in the Department of Government at American University. His research interests include American foreign policy, intelligence studies, U.S.-Israeli relations, the Middle East politics, and political psychology. We think, again, a very good lineup. And we want to thank again Dave Bean and the other members of our board who serve on the committee to generate our speakers. That allows us to bring the kinds of programs we have here. Just for your information, incidentally, today's presentation was the 22nd presentation since April that we presented online virtually like this. And we think by people's reactions that you valued it. And if you are a member, we thank you for your membership. And if you're not a member, we urge you to visit our website at www.whackreading.org to learn more about upcoming programs than those I've already reviewed, And that takes us through this coming June, incidentally. And learn more about other of our World Affairs Council programs which benefit members, students, and the larger community. Check us out and consider becoming a member if you are not now a member. Thank you again, Professor Dernbach, for your very valuable and important and interesting contribution to this whole topic of global warming and climate change.
Well, and thank you for inviting me. This has been a pleasure.